Hello, everyone. This is Kripa Anand, and welcome to the CanadianSME Small Business Podcast. Today, we are exploring the evolving world of anti-money laundering and anti-terrorist financing, and why strong compliance programs are now critical across financial and non-bank sectors. Joining us today is Mondiu Jaiyesimi, partner at MNP LLP, who leads AML and ATF advisory in Ontario. We'll discuss emerging AML trends, rising expectations for fintech and iGaming, and the role of boards in building a culture of compliance. So, before further ado, let's welcome the special guest. Mondiu, welcome to the podcast. Such a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you for having me, Kripa. Such a pleasure as well.
Mondiu, the AML landscape in Canada has evolved significantly over the last 2 to 3 years, right? With new risks emerging as technology and global events are shifting. So let's start the conversation by understanding from your perspective what key AML trends and emerging risks are Canadian reporting entities facing today, and how should the national risk assessment guide their compliance priorities? Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. That's an excellent question. I think the most important thing happening right now is the introduction of BOC2. So BOC2 is an update to the existing process of crime, money laundering, and terrorist financing acts. That's the sole AML legislation in Canada. So one of the changes that have been introduced via BOC2 is I meant BOC12. So the change introduces an increase in AML fines by 40 times. So what it means is the existing fines are going to go up by 40 times, and we're expecting more information around that from FINTRAC. So that's the most important change that is happening, and it's going to affect all reporting entities. And also, you spoke about the national risk assessment.
Correct.
The most recent version of the national risk assessment, I think we are all expected as reporting entities and AML professionals to leverage that when developing risk assessments. So all the sectors are currently covered. All reporting entities or reporting sectors are covered in that risk assessment. So when you're developing your risk assessment, you have to take advantage of that document as you prepare your inherent risk assessment. Also, one of the big changes is the your AML program is now going to be assessed to see if it's reasonably designed, risk-based, and effective. So that gives the AML regulator or supervisor, FINTRAC, a lot of an expanded scope when examining your program, and it gives them a lot of leverage in terms of assessing if it's reasonable. Also, there's the compliance agreement that you might be asked to enter into on the back of an examination from FINTRAC. So what that means is if they complete an examination and there's a bunch of deficiencies, you might be asked to enter into a compliance agreement to address those deficiencies and put target dates as to when you can fix them by. I'll just stop there, but those are, top of mind, the key issues that are affecting reporting entities now.
Definitely, that's a critical macro level view, right? It highlights that staying ahead of emerging typologies is the only way to effectively mitigate the sophisticated risks of modern finance crime. So, thank you for shedding light on that. Now, let's look at the specific challenges for emerging sectors and non-bank entities specifically. So, Mondiu, we've seen a decisive shift in how FinTrack approaches non-bank sectors like casinos, iGaming, and fintech firms. So the question is, how has the regulatory approach for non-bank entities changed, and what practical challenges do these organizations face in meeting FinTrack's rising expectations?
Yeah, I think we should go back to the national risk assessment. I think the national risk assessment does a very good job at identifying the inherent risks that are applicable to these designated non-financial businesses and professionals, if you can put them that way, or just non-bank reporting entities. So that's a good starting point to identify those inherent risks that affect them. But I think the other key part of this conversation is the fact that the National Risk Assessment identifies one of the biggest money laundering threats to Canada, which is the organized crime groups. They consider those designated non-financial businesses and professionals to be very vulnerable to money laundering and terrorist financing. So they've seen that they're taking advantage of the vulnerable nature or state of some of these businesses based on their size and scale. So that's an issue. And that's why at times when we speak to some of these smaller reporting entities, they raise concerns as to why they have to put all these measures in place. So that's the key thing. A national risk assessment is taking place, and then these sectors have been identified as potentially vulnerable. The other thing to consider is they can struggle with assessing the size and scale, or making sure the size and scale of the business is in line with the controls that they're going to put in place to mitigate money laundering and terrorist financing risk. So your ability to assess that. So some of these businesses are not as big as the banks or the credit unions that have the resourcing, the training, and the technical competency to put these things in place. So at times we still find that gap in understanding and in resourcing. So that's a challenge for them. So that maturity in understanding their AML obligations is still lacking. But again, I think education and increase in resourcing will help bridge that gap to a point.
That's again very well articulated, and that's a vital, sector-specific insight as well, because it proves that proactive program development is essential for high-growth industries like iGaming and fintech to avoid severe regulatory scrutiny. So now, moving ahead, let's discuss why governance is often the foundation or the breaking point of a compliance program. So, Mondiu, you argue that governance failures often create the largest AML risks, right? And the tone from the top is essential for success. So, why is governance essential to AML compliance, and how can organizations effectively engage boards that may not have deep AML expertise? Go ahead.
You train them. You train the board. I think that's a good that's a good starting point. You train. If you can't train internally, you train externally. You bring in external parties to train your board. It is absolutely important to ensure you have personnel at board level that understand the AML risk. It is very important. The reason is if there is something that you're not sure of as a chief anti-money laundering officer or a CCO, if there is something that if there's a particular risk that you're trying to mitigate and you are trying to escalate to your board, you would like folks that understand at least at a reasonable level, and they can provide some advice, or they can give some credible opinion on things relating to those risks. So it's very important. You can't demonstrate any effective AML program without strong governance or oversight. It drives the program essentially. So even though the CAMLO implements the program, the board is the organization essentially, and is ultimately responsible for compliance, including the approval of policies and procedures. So AML knowledge is very key. So investing in that knowledge, making sure you train your board on the high level information they need to know on emerging risks and their responsibilities. So from my experience, what we tend to advise reporting entities to focus on is the quality of reporting. What goes to the board, you have to improve the quality in terms of, your suspicious transaction reporting, high-risk businesses, any risks facing the business, maybe if you're seeing any trends relating to components that might affect your risk assessment, all of that information, or if you have any backlogs, or if you want to file a voluntary self-declaration of non-compliance to FINTRAC, all of that information that might really impact your ability to implement your program, or they might lead to regulatory fines. You want to ensure that you're keeping the board apprised and that the board is fully aware and prepared for any questions or any issues that might come up in the future.
Wow, that's a powerful leadership lesson, training, and emphasizes that compliance is a company-wide responsibility that must be championed by an informed and engaged board. So, thank you so much for that great reminder. But coming back to the practical advice for those who are preparing for that road ahead, preparing for a FINTRAC examination is one of the most stressful experiences for a compliance officer, right? Yet it is an inevitable part of the process. So, what advice would you give to organizations who are building or updating an AML program, and how can they best prepare for regulatory scrutiny of their monitoring and KYC processes?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to consider when you develop a program, depending on the size and scale of the business, if you are a small business and you're looking to develop a program, if you have technical expertise to develop the program yourself, go ahead and do it yourself. It's not there's no law that prevents you from doing that. But I think the most important thing is knowing that you need to build a very well-designed program. So most organizations tend to look at or look for reputable AML vendors to help them build that program, because it's really important to have a program that can stand up to regulatory scrutiny. The other part of this is it's really important as a compliance personnel or as a CAMLO to be engaged during that process. So if someone else is developing a program for you, you need to be engaged. You need to know what they're put it in place, because it will be your responsibility to implement whatever design they've put in place. So at times you see that mismatch or that misalignment between design and implementation effectiveness, where and of course BOC 12, like I mentioned before, they'll be looking at the effectiveness of your program. So how well are you putting into practice what you've actually documented? So it's important for the individuals responsible for implementing the program to understand what is documented, because you're going to be tested on that. So, for instance, your enhanced due diligence procedures, if you have multiple measures that you're going to take to mitigate risk of high risk clients or high risk transactions, you have to ensure you're doing them. If you consider them to be onerous, you can actually question whoever is delivering it or whoever is developing it for you to probably reduce some of those measures. Again, it's perfectly reasonable to do that. Your KYC processes, again, I would say the most important thing is to be able to test those processes we've put in place and the controls. Again, there's multiple ways of doing that. You can engage a third party to do a gap assessment. If you've developed it yourself, you want it tested independently to see how you're doing. Of course, there's the requirement to do a 2-year effectiveness review of the program anyways. You can also use that avenue to test. And then you can engage in your minor compliance testing as a compliance officer to see how strong your controls are as well. And then transaction monitoring, you want to be clear on what your transaction monitoring framework looks like, because you have an obligation to monitor transactions of your clients and their activities as well, including ongoing monitoring. So you want to make sure that there's clarity in the design of that transaction monitoring and ongoing monitoring process, that you understand it. It's very important. Again, no misalignment between what's being developed and what's actually put in practice. So once you understand it and it fits into the size and scale of business, and it's reasonable when you take into consideration the risks that you're facing, I think you're standing yourself in good stead and it sets you up for success.
That's a very actionable strategy, Mondiu. It confirms that readiness and rigorous internal testing are, at the end of the day, best defenses against potential regulatory deficiencies and penalties. And on this note, I'd like to give a special message to all of our listeners, specifically to all the Canadian business leaders. Are your AML controls up to date? You can learn from Mondiu Jaiyesimi, partner at MNP, about the shifting regulatory landscape, the critical role of board level governance, and how to prepare your business for the next FINTRAC exam. Now, coming back to you, Mondiu, you're so passionate about what you're doing. Very quickly, how did you get to do what you were doing today? Was this something that you were interested in as a kid, or did you stumble upon this in your career?
So my background is in economics,
Mm-hmm.
and when I completed my master's in economics, my first role was in compliance
Oh,
at a bank in the UK. So I did really well, and I found out I really liked it, and that was how everything kicked off. So I'm a big fan of regulatory compliance, and AML is such a huge topic for me that I'm really interested in, not just in Canada, but just
yeah.
globally. It's such an interesting topic, and there's multiple components to it. So yes, that's
Wow.
what I'm here.
It's great to see what you're doing today, and so much more power to you. I'm loving this conversation today, and definitely we'd love for you to be back, hopefully for an in-person conversation that we do the next in our studio. But for now today, before we let you go, if there's one message that you want our Canadian SME listeners to remember about managing regulatory obligations with confidence, if you could whisper something into their ears, what would you say and why?
So I would say AML compliance is not about being perfect. It's you would never find a perfect program. So that's why there's this terminology in BOC 12 about the requirement to ensure that your program is reasonably designed. So as long as it's reasonable, where we have controls in place that are reasonable compared to based on the size and scale of the business,
Mm-hmm.
and then you can actually speak to it with confidence. You understand it, you can speak to it. So when something is not normal, you can
Hmm.
identify that it is not normal. I think in AML, because most AML professionals they can do AML investigations. I think the
Yeah.
most important thing to note is your ability to identify what is not normal, because that means you understand your business. So once
Yeah.
you can do that, then you can identify abnormalities and flag them.
The AML doctor, right? Who?
100%.
Wow, that's a very powerful and actionable message, Mondiu. Thank you so very much. It has been
Thank you.
such a pleasure having you on the podcast.
Thank you very much.
All right, that wraps up our conversation with Mondiu Jaiyesimi from MNP on AML trends, regulatory expectations beyond traditional banking, and the importance of strong board oversight and compliance. To all of our listeners, thank you so much for tuning in to the Canadian SME Small Business Podcast. You can subscribe for more expert insights or visit CanadianSME.ca for more such resources. And now, an exclusive and special thank you to our partners, our exclusive shipping partner, UPS, and our exclusive HR partner, ADP. Thank you so much for your support in empowering SMBs in Canada. I'll see you all in the next episode. Kripa Anand signing off.